Volunteers, volunteers, volunteers. We need you. Yes, I'm talking about you, each and every one of you. This summer, we've got some great opportunities for volunteering. First of which is Bay Day, June 30th, the triathlon down at St. Albans Bay. And Church of the Rock has been the superstar leader with volunteers for the past many years. So we need you. If you don't know about it yet, we'll let you know about it. They're set up the day before, there's the actual event that day, and then takedown afterwards. It'll be a great event. And in addition to that, we have a new summertime event, and this one is all about our kids, the kids in Franklin County. There's going to be an FCA sports camp, and that's Fellowship of Christian Athletes. There's a sports camp happening here at Church of the Rock, and we need you during that week to help us out. We're expecting a bunch of kids to come hear the gospel message and worship the Lord and play sports together, learn things about one another, and most of all, the eye on Jesus. So we need help with that too. The Guatemala garage sale was a hit, a big success. So we thank you for all of those who donated items and all of you who volunteered your time, and for those who came and bought stuff. $3,600 for that event goes to building houses in Guatemala. So we say thank you. The capital campaign update. I want to thank you all who have donated thus far. We're at $66,000. We're inching our way up to our goal, which is $220,000. And we don't just want to make this place beautiful so that it looks good for all of us and sounds great for everybody. We're doing it for the next generation. We want this building to have an uplift so that it can be serving the people in our community for many, many years. As you've noticed, there are a few strings in the carpet, there are a few stains in the carpet. Our sound system isn't always tuned up to exactly what it should be. And then let's talk about our AV system. Sometimes we don't even have a PowerPoint. We need to upgrade our system, and we're excited to be able to do it. We're ready to pull the trigger and get going, so we need you all to be all in this event.
Well, a modern jetliner routinely cruises at an altitude of over 30,000 feet. You know how it is when the captain comes on and tells you how the flight's going to go, and it's always a number between 33 and 34, 35,000 feet, depending on how far you're going. And the air up there is very, very thin, which is why they want to go that high. The plane is much more efficient, and it's usually a smoother ride because you're above the clouds. And when you look out the window, sipping your Coke or your coffee, you may be pouring rain down below, or you just see blue skies and the bottoms of the tops of the clouds, and it's like you're in another world. But outside that window, if you know anything about 33,000 feet, it's a very different story. The air temperature is minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, and the air pressure is a little over a quarter of what it is here at sea level. Of course, neither passengers nor crew could ever survive being put in that environment. It would be like being higher than Mount Everest. And if you were to be suddenly put in that environment, your body would have absolutely no time to adjust. In the early days of flying, you know, those pictures you see of the daring, dashing pilots with their funky goggles and their silk scarves and their leather jackets, they would get in these open cockpit planes, and when they were really brave and really risky, they would go up to 18,000, 19,000 feet. But they couldn't stay there because they didn't have enough air to breathe. So they might go up for a moment and then have to come back down. They could never have imagined a plane going up to 30,000 feet and having it be full of hundreds of people, and having those people sitting in shirt sleeves, maybe playing a game on their iPad, or doing their work on a laptop, or watching a movie, and having a meal in the middle of that to boot. What made the difference was a decision made by the United States Army Air Corps back in the 1930s to find a way to get a plane up high where it could stay. Lockheed received the contract to do this, and in 1937 they remodeled one of their planes, the Model 10, and they created a plane called the XC-35. That's what you're looking at right there. This particular plane boasted a reinforced fuselage, stronger windows, and a mechanism for taking air from the engines and using it to increase the air pressure inside the plane. As a result, this plane was able to fly at 31,500 feet for hours, and it maintained a cabin pressure that was the equivalent of being about 12,000 feet above sea level, still very much survivable, as opposed to what was going on outside. So gone were the days of the silk scarves and the funky goggles. But to make this happen, that plane had to be stronger on the inside than everything that was going on outside of it. It had to be strong enough to hold a higher pressure than that much, much thinner air that was outside of it. It had to be a plane that could go to those high altitudes and fly safely there and keep its people warm when it was minus 40 outside. That this wasn't any longer just a matter of jumping in the cockpit. This plane had to be dissolved to be stronger on the inside than everything going on around it. Now, this church that we're looking at in the book of Acts, the first generation church, the very first Christians to leave tracks on this planet, faced this tremendous opposition as it took off and gained altitude in its quest to becoming a living example of God's new creation. And in order to stand up to those pressures, this early church had to be, guess what? Stronger on the inside than all the pressures that were around it. Luke gives us a glimpse of this inner strength that knit this church together in Acts chapter 4, verse 32. He says, all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. Now here we're looking at a group of people, ordinary people like you and me. Some of them very, very far from home because they had come to Jerusalem and been touched by the power of God, received His Spirit, put their faith in Jesus, and stuck around. And others were just the people of Jerusalem. They were now kind of suspect. They may have already begun to have been shunned by those around them. But they had a love and a concern for each other, so much so that they rewrote their personal economics. Their attitude became an all for one and a one for all. Basically, they could look at the people in this new group that they became a part of and say, we're all family, and we'll do for each other what family does for each other. And that made them stronger than the forces around them, than the institutional forces, the political forces, the social pressures that were being placed upon this new, brand new little group. But I want you to notice that this strength that they had was far more than a bunch of people simply trying to be nice to each other. I mean, we all have those moments when we say to ourselves, well, I really ought to try to be a nicer person. I really ought to try to think before I speak, or maybe I should just share something with some people once in a while. You know, the United Way campaign goes through the office, and everybody's touched with generosity for at least a brief period of time. This went way deeper than that. Because you see, what they were doing was they were discovering how to be God's new creation in action. This wasn't like a temporary little thing that they would do. This was something that was redefining who they were and setting tracks for you and for me as we explore what it means to be a church that follows Jesus. Now, to pressurize a plane like the Lockheed XC-35 or any of the planes that you fly on today, you have to do two things. First of all, you need a cabin that can hold the pressure. You have to build a container that won't just explode when you put more pressure inside it than there is outside of it. And secondly, you need a power source to pump pressurized air into that container. That cabin isn't going to simply hold pressure because you just flew it up to a higher altitude. You need to have a continual source of power that keeps that cabin filled with far more air pressure than is what's going on outside. The Lockheed engineers who built the XC-35 drew off high-pressure air from the engines to continually pressurize the cabin. They used the engines, which were pushing the plane forward, to also provide air pressure into the cabin, and that same strategy is used to this very day. So what about this church in Jerusalem that was going to be flying at a brand new altitude, doing something people had never done before? Well, this church needed a power that would give it that stronger pressure of God's love, of God's faithfulness, of God's presence than the world around them. And they found that power in the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. Luke says in verse 33 and 34, with great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And God's grace, another form of his power, God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all, that there were no needy persons among them. God's resurrection power was this engine that was driving this plane through the air. But it was also working a transformation on the inside. It wasn't just about Christians going out and showing how powerful God is to people who had not yet come to faith. As wonderful as that is, it was also a power that was working on the inside. It was working among them, changing how they related to each other, giving them a totally different view of everything, and in this case, of their basic finances, and of what they needed versus what someone else might need. So you see, that resurrection power doesn't just make us stronger than what's going on around us, it empowers us on the inside. Here they became a community that took such good care of its members that Luke could say there were no needy persons among them. No needy persons among them. So what did this resurrection power look like in practice? What did this church look like? Well, in verse 34 and 35, Luke tells us, for from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them. Notice this was an occasional thing. It wasn't a thing that said, well, if you come to the church, you have to sell your house to get in. It just said that when a need came up, people responded. It's sort of like what Pastor Rob shared just a few moments ago at the offering, that this young man needed treatment and someone else said, well, I don't have a whole lot, but I can give something. And I think of some of these amazing crowdsourcing things that happen, and you'll see a tragedy and this huge financial need that a family might have, and you think, oh, how could that ever be met? And then you get the story that the thing went online and went viral, and how many dollars have come in for that? Well, that was going on in this church. So he says, for from time to time, those who owned a land or a house, sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. To put something at someone's feet meant to give it to them so that they would have authority over it. So here was a church that was guided by people who were following the directions that they were receiving from God. We're providing administration, we're providing wisdom, we're figuring out where the real needs were, and people were able to trust each other enough to say, well, I see a need over there, and so I'm going to bring something that I have and I do not need as much as that person needs what they're going through, and bring that to those who can properly administrate that God can work through that system. Jesus himself had said, and when Luke quotes this in chapter 6 in the Beatitudes, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Now, he wasn't saying, blessed are you who are poor because you're supposed to be poor. He was saying, blessed are you who are poor because you're going to receive something far greater than you ever imagined. You're going to become part of God's family. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Well, now here in this first generation of a Christian church, a community of believers had come together and found a way to make Jesus' words come true. When they saw someone who was poor, they said, well, in God's family, we take care of that situation. When they saw someone who was hungry, they said, well, in God's family, we find a way to solve that problem. These were believers who had in many cases come from the far-flung reaches of the Roman Empire. And some of them were in dire need. We read in chapter 6 that they had widows in their group. Now remember, this is at a time when there were no survivor benefits, there was no Social Security, there was no welfare system. All of that was done through people giving to needy people. And so here, this group became a group which took care of its own. God gave the church a special empowerment, a grace, Luke calls it, to not just cope with the problem, but to turn it into an opportunity for building an entirely different economy. It was new creation in action. If you want to know what God's new creation looks like, here is a glimpse of it. New creation powered by the same power that raised Jesus from the dead. I wonder how often we put the resurrection of Jesus in one box, and then we have a bunch of other boxes for everything else going on in our life. Well, these people had found out that because Jesus rose from the dead, that changed everything. There aren't any more boxes. And my finances aren't a separate thing from what God is doing in His world. Frankly, how I take care of God's environment is not a separate thing from the new creation that Jesus is bringing in. How I treat my neighbor, how I relate to my spouse, how I talk to my kids, all of those things are meant to be characterized by the new creation power of Jesus. And these folks made this a very practical thing, given the fact that they were in a situation with people from all over the world who were suddenly trying to eke out a living in a place far away from home in this new faith community. Now, Luke gives us an example that you might call Exhibit A of what this looked like. So he told us what they did, but then he says, let's talk about one person, a man named Joseph. Verse 36 and 37 says, Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, so he was an out-of-towner, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field he owned and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet. It was just one example out of we don't know how many. Now, this Joseph was a Jewish man from the world outside the Jewish homeland. So he knew what it felt like to be an outsider. You know, what do we call people who come from other parts of the country? Flatlanders. Even if they come from Denver, where you look at 14,000-foot flat things called mountains, right? Well, he was a flatlander as far as these folks were concerned. He was an out-of-towner. So he knew what that felt like. He had a property somewhere, we don't know where it was, and he set the example of saying, you know what, I am so invested in this group of people that I'm with, and I just feel that this is what God's doing in my life, and I'm going to make what I have a blessing to someone else. The apostles actually gave him a new name. His name was Joseph, pretty common name, probably one of the most common names in the time of Jesus. But they called him Barnabas, and this is something that Jesus had done. He'd given Peter a new name. He'd given various people new names, and that new name was, you might call, a new creation name. It's like, oh yeah, well, your mom and dad called you Joseph, but in God's new creation, you're a son of encouragement. You have a whole new identity. We see that coming off of you. I wonder what our new creation names would be. We don't do that in our Christian time here. I know that in some parts of the world, for instance, when we went to Africa, it was very common. In fact, it was absolutely common for people to take on a Christian name, even though they already had their traditional name. It was part of being in the family of God. Well, Barnabas got a new name, and it fit his new creation identity. It matched his gifts. It matched his passion. And we only know him as Barnabas. If anybody said, you know, Joseph, the guy who traveled with Paul, we would all go, oh, Joseph who? But you say Barnabas, and you find him throughout the book of Acts, many chapters of it, working this same gift of compassion. Acting in this new identity, you see, he exemplified the resurrection power of Jesus. This is what resurrection power looks like. Look at Barnabas. He made the church stronger on the inside than all the opposition and difficulties facing it from without. Barnabas would have a long and distinguished career as a servant of Jesus. He's the person who went looking for a guy named Paul. Actually, Saul was his Jewish name. His name, Paul, we know him by. Paul was somebody that had converted to Jesus, but because he had been such a persecutor, such a part of the opposition, the Christians were understandably a little bit frightened of this guy. They thought maybe he's just a plant. Maybe he's faking a conversion and then coming in so he can get more names on his list and then really bring the hammer down. But Barnabas was willing to take a chance on this guy, Paul. And he went out and found him when non-Jews began coming into Jewish Christian churches. Barnabas said, well, you know, I know what it feels like to be an outsider. And I know that God has touched all people the same, not just one ethnic group. And this guy, Paul, he may seem like a misfit, but I'll bet God has a special place for him. And of course, he certainly did. You see, that same generosity and that same grace that enabled Barnabas to divest himself of a piece of land would motivate him to share the good news with people outside his own ethnic group. That's what resurrection power looks like. It's a love and a grace that strengthened churches made up of both Jews and Gentiles. And thank God that happened, because now our church is probably mostly a Gentile church and blessed with some Jewish people in it. This would empower a church that would face 300 years of waves of persecution, and by all rights should have disappeared off the face of the earth, like any number of other religious movements of that time. But you see, it was stronger on the inside than the pressures on the outside. This resurrection power in the church could be described as a shared life. You know, when you board an airplane, first class doesn't get more air pressure than economy. You, the people up front with the big seats and the special treatment, and the people in the cockpit, they all get the same air, and they all get the same amount of it. Everybody shares the pressurized air and the comfortable temperature. The same is true with God's family. We're commanded to be a people who live this shared life. Now, this shared life is going to take on different forms in different situations. In the early Jerusalem church, people pooled their resources and allowed the leaders to administer them according to need. They were doing so in response to a specific set of problems that they were trying to solve. In other churches in the Bible, the shared life took the form of hospitality, of forgiving a runaway slave, of visiting friends in prison, or of sharing the Lord's Supper without the barriers of social class. These were all examples of the same thing, this grace of God's love and God's presence poured out in our midst. So what would this shared life look like in our church? Well, whatever form it takes, it'll look like and feel like God's love in action. Jesus put it this way in John 13:34 and 35. A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. And we could paraphrase that to say, by this, everyone will realize that you're stronger on the inside than all of the hate and suspicion and fear and greediness that's present on the outside. I want to thank the two of you. We can really love on you guys, because next week you won't have to endure this anymore. But you have demonstrated for us the shared life by sharing your lives, by going above and beyond. It's not enough to just go to all the work of fixing the tables for a communion luncheon for people that you've never met before and will never see again. But those tables need to be decorated, and they need to have cut flowers, and that room has to feel the way it would feel if it were your mom who had passed away or your family member. That's the shared life. You've demonstrated that over and over again, giving rides, taking people to doctor's appointments, taking people to the hospital. You have no idea how many times Penny would come in during the week, usually at staff meeting, and just mention a need that the rest of us hadn't heard of yet, bringing us up to speed and making sure that these things were covered. You see, those are all examples of just sharing the life. Or, as Jesus put it, by loving each other. So you leave us with a legacy, and now it's going to be exciting to see how God fills that empty place that is created by your going somewhere else, by raising that up. And I hope it is done in the lives of each one of us that have been touched by you, because we know that God has a big plan, and He brought you here to be blessed and to be a blessing. And now we're going to just bless you into that next stage of what God has for you. The table that's before us this morning is the table of fellowship. We call it the communion table. And the word communion comes from the Greek word for being community, for being together, for being one. And so as we partake here, let's just remind ourselves that what we're sharing in, as we share this little remembrance of a meal, the bread and the cup, that we're really sharing in something much more than a religious moment or a ritual. We're sharing in the very resurrection life of Jesus. And I want to challenge you, as I'm going to challenge myself, to keep my ears open to where God wants to do something special, because He wants all of us to be a Barnabas in some way or another. Can we bow our heads?